So, as I was saying before, when you're learning a new language, you're often taught the syntax and standard library and modules for parsing XML, accessing the database, that kind of stuff. But tools kind of fall by the wayside until one day you're working on your application. It's like, okay, well, how do I print a stack trace? Or how do I print this, object that I know nothing about with standard error? So I'm going to be talking about the kind of tools that you can do this stuff with in Perl. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is module installation. So every module we're going to talk about can be found on the CPAN, and it doesn't help us if we can't install the modules to use them. So we're going to be developing this sort of developer's workbench over the course of the talk, but first we have to know how to install them. So in the beginning there was the old way, and the old way was going to search.cpan.org, downloading, building, and installing the tarball yourself. It sucked because if you had any dependencies that needed to be installed, you would follow the dependency chain yourself, and it was horrible. So then we had the cpan command, which is pretty handy. It does a lot of the ugly stuff for you. It figures out where to get the tarballs from, fetches them, builds them, but it still is a little, it has a long way to go in terms of UI. And then we have vendor-provided packages like RPMs or devs. This is nice, but it also can be problematic if your Linux distribution doesn't package a module you need, or if they're not packaging the right version, they're out of date or something like that. So what's the new way? Well, Kanming already mentioned it's cpan-. And the advantage of cpan- is it's a command line utility like cpan, but it doesn't get in your way. It doesn't ask you for 20,000 different options when you start it up for the first time. It just installs your modules and just does it. I say that anyway. So it's a zero configuration tool, unlike cpan, but it doesn't mean it's not flexible or powerful. There's a lot of different things you could do with it. So you can tell it, okay, only install from this cpan mirror, or don't run the tests, or continue to install the module even if the tests fail, or download the tarball and open a shell inside that tarball's directory so I can inspect the module and play with it. Very handy. So sometimes you don't want to install modules globally. Maybe you don't have root access. I, for one, don't really trust companies that give their developers a laptop or a KVM and say, oh, you don't have root. But this happens, it happens occasionally. Sometimes you don't want modules to be available globally. Maybe you've got a debugging module and you want to make sure that no one puts this in production code so that they're not littering the log files with a bunch of useless output, or they're slowing things down in some core routines. And maybe that you manage all of your blessed modules via the system package manager to have that warm fuzzy feeling, but maybe you don't have a package for a module, and maybe you're trying to do something new that you don't have a package for, like logging, where there's 20,000 packages for on cpan, or configuration where there's another 20,000 packages for. So how are you going to evaluate them without building RPMs for all of them? And when you finally do that, then you're going to discard probably all but one of them. So we can use local lib, which Kanming also already talked about. So I won't go into it more because he already did a good coverage of it, but it's very handy, especially in that kind of environment where you need this isolation, or you just, you're not going to go so far as to install Perl brew, but you want to be able to have this suite of personal tools on a box with the system Perl. So let's talk about regular expressions. Let's do a little survey here. Who here has written a regular expression? Yeah, that's what I thought. So we're Perl programmers, that's what we do. So, little quiz. Does anyone recognize this regular expression? It actually goes on for another 3 or 4 slides, but I truncated it.
JSON parser.
Yes, it's a JSON parser. This regular expression was written by Randall Schwartz not too long ago, and it parses JSON. So this is an example of how easy it is to abuse regular expressions. So then, when you are working with a gargantuan regular expression like this, and it breaks, you've got a problem. Yeah. So, how do we debug regular expressions? Well, the old tried and true method is printf debugging. And you can use that funny syntax there to insert snippets of code into your regular expression, so they'll be evaluated when your regular expression is evaluated itself. You can also go with the other tried and true method of taking pieces out of your regular expression and adding new ones and seeing what breaks things and what doesn't. Well, there's a third you can use a debugger. What debugger? Regex debugger, which is very hard to say if you're saying it out loud. So I'm going to show you regex debugger. So
Off screen.
here's some code that just does some primitive parsing of a file extension, and in this code we're going to interpret only the characters after the final dot as the extension. So in this case it would be .gz. So if I run it, it says the extension is tar.gz, but it should be gz. So let's enable regex debugger. And the cool thing about regex debugger is that it's lexical. So if you use it in an if block or something for one regex, it doesn't affect any of your regular expressions in your program. And that's one of my favorite features about Perl, is you get these pragma-like modules where you can enable features and magic in a small isolated context without contaminating the rest of the program. So let's see what happens when we run the code with regex debugger. So we drop in this cool, neat display thing, and it shows us where in the regex it is and where in the string it is. So we can step through, and it's going to just tell you what it's doing. Oh, I failed. Oh, I failed. Oh, I failed. And,
holy shit.
Yeah. And then it matches the first full stop. And then it says, okay, I'm going to capture here. And then it's going to say, okay, I'm going to try. It tells you exactly what it's doing. It says, okay, any character except new line 0 more times, as many as possible. It doesn't assume you know, oh yeah, it's a full stop, it's a star. It explains it very verbosely. It tells you to match. Great. Tells you what's in each match group as you're going along. And then another cool thing about regex debugger is it tells you, I mean, so most people should know what $sign means, but I feel that a lot of programmers don't. Everyone thinks end of string, but it's really end of string or final new line, depending on what flags you supply when you compile the regular expression. So it can also be a learning tool for a regular expression to see how the engine is actually interpreting what you're doing. So now it says, yeah, it passed. But we knew it passed, it just had the wrong output. And it matched in 21 steps, which is another thing in case you're worrying about performance. So, that's regex debugger. Next is inspecting objects. So, I do a lot of work with the Google Web Services. And the Google Web Services are all documented, but they're not documented terribly well, and sometimes, very often, the documentation doesn't often match reality. And also, they're documented for Java programmers using wonderful SOAP libraries. So the representation of this response object in Perl isn't always consistent with what you would expect given the documentation. So what I do is when I'm working with a new service, I grab the object and I dump it to see how I can manipulate this object in Perl. So how can we inspect objects? Well, we've got the venerable data dumper, which is shipped with Perl, and it gives you a lot of output, but it prints pretty much all the internals of a Perl object. You've got data dumper concise, which is kind of a wraparound data dumper that just toggles some of the nicer flags, like it automatically sorts the keys and it makes slightly terser output. This is my personal favorite variant of data dumper. But then also, we have data printer, which is my new favorite. So, instead of explaining everything that data dumper or data printer does right now, let me show it off. Ah, that is the wrong terminal. That's the right one. So, data printer. So here we've got some code that constructs a simple mock object, something simple, with some scalars and a nested hash graph, some objects. And we're going to use data printer to print it out. So one nice thing about data printer is instead of saying print standard error dumper object, it just exports a single subroutine P into your namespace. And P automatically knows, okay, you're printing the standard error. It's one of those little things that really makes it a lot easier to use. So let's print that. Okay, so we got a lot of output. So I have data printer configured, so it tells me where it printed. Because if you've got a lot of these statements, it's kind of hard to figure out what was printed where. It does fancy colors, because I like fancy colors. It tells me every method I can call on a datetime object, which can be a little overly verbose, but you can also turn this off. It tells me what the internals of a datetime object look like. And it does the same for URI. If you're developing a class, there are hooks that data printer will invoke. So you can, when data printer prints it, it says, hey, data printer, print me like this. You can also go the reverse way and add hooks in your configuration file saying, okay, if I'm printing a date time, print it like this, so you can add support after the fact. So that's supposed to say we need to go deeper. So sometimes you want to know how things look like in memory. So if you've messed around with XS at all, you know about SVs and AVs and HVs and all the other Vs. And sometimes you just want to know if my ref count is correct. You know, if I'm returning things with the correct ref count so they get garbage collected automatically. And sometimes you want to inspect things for performance reasons. Make sure that your scalars aren't holding on to extra string buffers or something. So for that you can use develop peak, which is installed in core. And this is another module where it's just best to see what it does. Okay, so here's our source for develop peak. We just use it, and I create a string, and I just substitute the hello with hi to make it a little more interesting. And then I dump the string, or the scalar, as I should say. So develop peak gives us this wonderful information, where it is in memory, what the reference count is, what the flags are. The offset flag, I won't go over that. If you're curious about what all this means, you can read Perl guts or any of the associated documentation. But it's really handy when you need to dig down at this low level, and it's also handy when you're curious about how Perl really works. Okay, fun with stack traces. All right, let's go through a little thought experiment. Let's say you're in a room with a moose. That moose. So you write your application in Moose, and it's object-oriented, and it's wonderful, and then you deploy it to production, and after a few days, or a few weeks, or a few months, your application throws an exception, and you get this wonderfully helpful error. Yeah, bad value at access or room width defined at test.pl, line 5, line 13. To give you an idea about the source of that, so you've got a nice room package here with some trivial accessors, and the trigger that just checks that the width is non-negative. And then we create some subroutines to make the stack trace a little more interesting. So we don't even get a useful, I don't even remember what the line number is. Line 5, line 13. Oh, it's angry. Okay, so line 5, yeah, that's helpful. Line 13, not helpful. So what we can do here is we need another pragma-like module called carp always. What carp always does, it says, when your application dies or croaks or whatever, it automatically prints a stack trace. So instead of that useless line of output we just saw, you get a full stack trace. Happened at line 21, and this is what it was called, and everything. I don't know why this stack trace is appearing twice, but I don't care enough to fix it. Getting faster feedback. So when you want to incrementally improve upon a piece of code, or what I want to incrementally improve upon a piece of code, I usually open my text editor, start creating a file called test.pl, and then I add to it and add to it and add to it until my code is working. An alternative strategy is to use the -e flag on the command line. Just create a one-liner and just keep incrementally improving it. But sometimes it doesn't really work because let's say you're talking to a web service and they rate limit you. Well, if you have to run your script so many times, eventually you might get cut off. Or maybe you have to rely on some database results that take 5 or 10 minutes to compute. And then you have to wait and wait and wait every time you want to play with the results. So funny story, I actually learned Python before I learned Perl. That's pretty unusual. You don't often hear people migrating that way. But when I learned Python, I just typed Python and it was like, oh cool, I can inspect these objects and I can print stuff and I can use it as a calculator. It's great. And then when I started picking up Perl, I just typed Perl and hit enter and nothing happened. And I was like, okay. And then I Control-C'd out and read man Perl run and I was enlightened. So it would be nice if Perl had a REPL like Python. What does? We've got devel and its sibling reply. Devel REPL's been around for a little longer, so it's got some more plugins. It's also a little heavier. I honestly have not tried reply, but I've heard very good things about it. So if you're interested in a REPL, please try both, and make your own conclusion. So of course, like everything else in this, you get a demo. So re.pl. So now we're dropped into a redevelop print loop. I can do things like say 17, and I can say my value equals 17, and I can ask what value is. So the cool thing about devel REPL is as a plugin so that lexical context persists between subsequent lines. So even though my value is a lexical, it's still available to the subsequent lines. I can also say, hey, what time is it? I can use other modules, like so. And then you've got wonderful command line completion. So I can ask for every method on datetime. And it even is smart enough to have a hook for completing use statements.
What? Yes, we have.
And don't ignore that. And so I can create a GitHub object.
Yeah, you
I
have.
was not doing anything with that.
Can't see that.
Oh,
Yeah,
damn.
well,
Sorry. Well, I created a GitHub object, suffice to say. Yeah, so that's developer. There's a bunch of plugins for it. So if you check it out, be sure to consider which plugins are available before you make your final decision. All right, so I had a lot of tools that I considered for this talk. Unfortunately, not everyone made the cut for the full treatment. So here I'm going to go through my honorable mentions. There's PM tools, which just is a set of command line tools that allow you to ask, where is a module? What version of module do I install? That kind of stuff. You've got mini CPAN, which allows you to have a mirror of the CPAN on your local hard drive. Very handy if you want to do some hacking on a train with really crappy Wi-Fi. Perl doc, which is in core. I've met a surprising amount of people who didn't realize that you could view documentation with the command line. So that's how you do it. There's CPAN doc by Sartak, which is kind of a fork of Perl doc, where if it's not found on your local disk, it will consult the meta CPAN and grab the pod from there. And then I wrote a fork of his CPAN doc called mcpan doc, which will do the same thing, but it consults your mini CPAN instead of the meta CPAN. So that means if you have a mini CPAN that's up to date, yeah, I know, a lot of mcpan.
Deeper.
So if you're on a plane with no Wi-Fi and you've got an up-to-date mini CPAN, you can view all documentation for all modules on the CPAN even without internet access. You've got fork proof, which is a godsend when you're testing a module that has that's kind of heavy. So what it'll do is it'll preload all the modules that you need for your test suite to tell it which ones to preload, and then it'll run all of your tests. And then I've got this moose-based parser I wrote, and it drops the test time from like 20 seconds to 3. It's pretty amazing. Cobrew, already discussed. Yep. Develop trace, which is another developer backend. All it does is it just prints every line that Perl's executing as it executes it. It gives you a lot of output, but it's really handy if you're, for example, Perl seg faults and you want to find out what the last expression that Perl evaluated was. Be concise, prints the Perl op tree. It's another one of those interesting how does Perl work inspection modules. BD parse just tells Perl, the Perl compiler, to parse into an op tree and spit it back out as source so that you can get an understanding of what the code is if it's particularly convoluted. There's Perl critic for the people who really are dogmatic about style. So you can tell Perl critic, I have these policies I want to enforce, and it will complain about policies that are not currently violated in that body of source. Distzilla, which is wonderful if you're a module author. For the longest time, I wrote modules and I was afraid to actually publish them to the CPAN because I was afraid I was going to screw things up and people would laugh at me. So after the first 2 or 3 modules, I embraced Distzilla and it just becomes so much easier. So if you're looking into writing modules, I highly suggest it. It does take a bit of time to tweak and configure, but I think it's worth it. There's DBI profile dumper. This seems to be a reoccurring discussion we have at Booking where people will talk about, well, I'm adding instrumentation to SQL stuff, but DBI already has it built in. So I won't recite the DBI documentation, but suffice to say, DBI profile dumper, when enabled, will dump all of your query information to disk, and DBI prof allows you to query that information. So you can ask it, what queries am I running the most often, or which ones are taking the longest time? Data show is another data dumping like module. It's kind of halfway between say and data printer or data dumper. It does some simple stuff like printing array refs, but it also tells you what the name of the variable you're dumping is, and also what line it's being printed on. Module core list is a module that allows you to ask what version or which modules were included with a version of Perl, or whether or not a module is included with Perl, and if so, what version it was included with. There's the meta CPAN, which is my personal favorite alternative to search.cpan.org. It's prettier, which is kind of vain, but it does make a difference to me. I find the search results are often more accurate. And to me, most importantly, it's open source. And the meta CPAN guys are very open contributors. You have AppPM uninstall, which we've got already mentioned, and CPAN outdated, which we've got also already mentioned. So, thanks to everyone who wrote modules that I talked about today, because they're all wonderful and they make my life a lot easier. Does anyone have any questions? No questions? Oh.
So apparently if I search on Google for Perl Power Tools, there's actually a project
Ah!
called Perl Power Tools.
Well, they re-implemented a bunch of
Yeah, a
small
bunch of
libraries
Unix
and small
utilities in
functions.
Perl.
Damn. Oh well.
So,
It's old, it's a very old project.
yeah.
Yes, though a few of them are actually like updated and stuff. I know Tom Christensen has a bunch of Unix tools that are based on those power tools, but with the main difference that they are doing Unix correctly, unlike the original Unix tools that are kind of assuming ASCII.
Oh, you're talking about Unicode Tussle?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's handy. So I debated mentioning Unicode Tussle. It's more of a Unicode power tool than a Perl power tool, though. It's cool. I recommend it. But it's distributed by Brian DeFoy, I believe, instead of Tom, because I don't think Tom distributes that much himself.
What's it called again?
Unicode Tussle.
Awesome.
Yeah, it kind of has install issues on most computers because one dependency.
Asks for input. It is annoying. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Thanks.